hear me?
Yes.
You're all good. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Baz. Good morning. Right, so we're just running a presentation this morning about the Development Contributions Policy. So first of all, kia ora koutou, ko Lila Martley, tōku ingoa. We've got a message coming through from Councillor Panner. Okay. Yeah, ko Lila Martley, tōku ingoa, no motukarangi te kāinga. I'm working in the policy team and been working on the Development Contributions Policy Review. Today we're doing a workshop to introduce the Development Contributions Policy, and a review has been in progress, being prepared for the Finance and Performance Committee meeting on the 21st of October. And at that point we'll be asking for agreement to consult. So this workshop is really a 101 to talk about the policy itself, because it's got a lot of components. And I'm just going to move my slides along. So, sorry, I've just caught the slides up. It's a bit new technology for me this morning. So the revised policy is being prepared for Finance and Performance Committee meeting, and this is to give you an overview of how the current policy works, so that you'll be able to have a good understanding and be ready to consider amendments and the statement of proposal. So it's one of the longer policies that Council manages. It's comprised of operational policy and the higher level policy details. So in the operational policy, we have what the charges are, because development contributions are council charges and a source of revenue, when people pay them, and then detail like process for objections, remissions, postponements, and special assessments. And we'll be touching on all of those as we go through here. Then it's also got the policy details, how they're calculated, and the rationale for having them is why we have them. So there's a lot of content detail, and then policy map zones, which are about areas served by specific infrastructure. So there's quite a bit of ground to cover, and we'll try and get through some of that quite quickly. So the policy is about charges for development in Wellington City and how they're calculated. There's a little bit of repetition through here, but if it's new to you, hopefully that's helpful. There's principles in the Local Government Act and a lot of specifications. So even though we're not changing methodology at this review, it's good to get some familiarity. The main differences that are going to be coming up is a new template. And what that means is there's a new format, and there's a lot of form text that's been developed to help councils align with best practice and align really closely with the Local Government Act. So when we say a new template, it's a new presentation, a bit of restructuring. There's going to be new charges, and these are based on the long-term plan 2131. So they come from population growth assumptions and capital expenditure, and this is coming up in the next few slides. We're updating the maps because we've got a few new development areas, so that will be bits of rural land that are now going into being under development, and then we've got the more concise methodology. So just a few process notes about how the review is being conducted. So the main trigger is we've had the policy since 2005. It's had regular review, and this review is triggered by having a new long-term plan 2021-31. We've been working with a development contributions expert because they do have so many components. There's very few experts in the country, and we've been working with Gina Sweetman, who's really recognised in the area and helped the Department of Internal Affairs to develop the template. The work's involved teams right across the organisation. So if you can think of people who should have been involved as we're going across, hopefully we have captured them. It involves capital costs, it involves knowing about population growth. There's a detailed financial model that's based in Excel-based, and that's been brought up to speed. All the asset managers, so anyone who's running a capital project or involved or developed, and then the operational teams who administer the development contributions. So part of the reason we've structured two workshops, one reason is we don't have Gina here today, but we thought it had a really good natural flow to have an introduction today. And then late next week, the papers will be ready, and provided to you about the changes and the revised policy. And then we'll have a second workshop on the 19th of October where we can look at the changes and work through questions. On the 21st of October, we'll be asking Finance and Performance Committee approval to consult, and that's under Section 82 of the Local Government Act. Run the consultation in November and come back with a final for approval in early 2022. So the very different medium for presenting is, so I'll just keep going and then we'll stop for questions in a little while. Good. So the principle of a development contribution is that it's a council charge and it helps pay for the impact of new residential and commercial developments on services and infrastructure like supply and wastewater. And sitting underneath it is it's the principle that those causing...
I know, this is what they talk to us.
Pardon? No? Okay, so that those causing the need for the additional infrastructure and reserves contribute to the capital cost. So it's about equity between current and future residents, and it's centred around capital expenditure. So just to talk a little bit more to that principle, it's kind of like we know people are coming to Wellington. We're preparing for them to come by making everything a bit bigger, but we can't present people with a bill when they arrive in town. The reasonable point and the point that these charges occur is around buildings, so the buildings and development. And so they apply to development projects that enable more people to live and work in Wellington. So that's on new houses, flats or apartments, subdivisions, adding to gross floor area of a commercial building and new retail areas. Martin, should I hand over to you to talk to, so Martin's going to talk to what kind of capital expenditure we charge development contributions on.
Okay, I think somebody's got their microphone on, so you might just want to check that you're on mute there so we can just box over that interruption. Thank you.
Councillor Calvert keeps going on and off.
Okay. Thanks, Lila and Morena councillors. So as Lila sort of outlined, the development contributions policy is mainly a funding policy for the council, and it's an alternative policy for funding capital expenditure and the construction of assets. And I guess this diagram just tries to simplify that down and show how we fund all of our capital expenditure. So part of the financial statements and the LTP, we have to split our capital expenditure into three groups. And in the funding impact statement, it outlines how much is in each of those groups. So every time we build or purchase a new asset, it's either replacing an existing asset or it's an improving a level of service. So it's got greater capacity or new services, or it's being provided for growth, and that's growth in population and workforce. And so as you can see there, the three different ways we generally fund that capital expenditure is when we replace assets, that's usually funded through rate funding our depreciation of our existing assets, and that's funded over time, and that's financed through borrowings and repaying borrowings. Through improving levels of service, that's why our borrowings is generally increasing, because we are building new assets or assets with greater capacity that improves levels of service, and that increases our borrowings, and that's why our borrowings are going up. With development contributions, they're initially funded by borrowings, but then the growth-related assets for new population and workforce, where you've got new capacity, new pipes, particularly in greenfields areas, or increased capacity on existing roads, for example, then that's initially financed through borrowings, but then those borrowings are repaid through development contributions, which is the policy that we're obviously talking about now. And that's the bit that this entire policy focuses on.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I also just, in switching to the online medium, I have lost a few minutes to just backtrack. So Elizabeth Steele is also in the room, and Elizabeth's been working on the financial model to get all the new information into it and make sure it lines up across all aspects of the policy. So this is an additional slide about growth. So I guess from what Martin was saying, development contributions can only be collected on expenditure that's related to growth, and that's relative to renewals, growth, and the level of service. Also wrapped into that level of service is meeting new standards, so any new health and safety, new construction standards, new standards for providing infrastructure, and also community demand for higher levels of service. Now, I've just got the figures up there from the 21-31 LTP, and you'll see there's 555 million over 10 years attributed to growth. Now, something important to distinguish when you do get the next version of the policy next week, the growth in the long-term plan and in the development contributions policy don't completely line up. So when projects get classified in the long-term plan, they get classified by their greatest component. So if something is 60% growth, 20% renewal, 20% level of service, it gets classified as growth. And similarly, a renewal project might have a 10% component of growth in it. There's some growth projects that don't fit the development contributions criteria, and things like that would fit in there, like city housing, construction of social housing, because that's not an infrastructure that serves growth or new people in the city. And there's some older projects on the asset schedule that remain, and that's for places like Moa Point, which was built for at least up to 300,000 people, and we're not there yet. So that's been on the schedule for a long time, and we're still collecting on that in several areas.
Just to give you an example of what that means and what Lila's talking about, how one project could have a number of different components to it. For example, if you were renewing a wastewater pipe that was at the end of its life, then that's generally a renewal, but the size of that pipe might be increasing when you renew it to create some capacity for growth and population. And so there may be a 20% component of growth in that project, an 80% renewal, and therefore we've got to extract that growth component out in the numbers to be able to collect development contributions, even though the majority of that project is a renewal project, and wouldn't be classified that in the funding impact statement.
Okay, so now we're going to dive into a little bit of the detail of the operational policy of how it all works, and it still crosses off a little bit with the principles of the growth, but how we charge development contributions, or a concept that's important to understand, is an equivalent housing unit. So that's based around the household size and the demand it creates for water, wastewater, transport. So that'll be like litres per household per day, assumptions around transport trips made, and land needed for reserves per person. So that's called the equivalent housing unit, and it's one of the key concepts in the development contributions policy, and it's what charges are based on. So basically anyone building a house, say a 2-bedroom house, that is one equivalent housing unit. If someone's building a really small housing unit, 1 bedroom or less, it drops down to 0.7 of an EHU, and that's just a fair discount, assuming that fewer people will be living in that size dwelling. So there's growth projections built into the modelling and the planning. We're expecting in the next 20 years another 13,894 households and another 5,639 units of non-residential. So that's, so we've talked to growth, we've talked to the units of growth, and then the next thing is catchments. So we can't, under the Local Government Act, just add up all the growth and divide it to provide an average across the city. The benefits, they need to relate to where the development and the benefits will be. So these are set by catchment, and that's based on asset location and the benefits for water, infrastructure, transport, reserves. So, there's a couple more slides on that. But then there are citywide charges where the benefits go across the city and you can't really attribute them to one area. So something like the Botanic Gardens would be in those, and then stormwater projects are generally citywide.
Just to add to that point, Lila, so just in those units of demand, our non-residential or commercial demand, you'll see there is based on a floor size in terms of 42 square metres area. That's sort of making an assumption that our commercial developments are sort of office buildings. We also have another process whereby we actually individually, if it's not an office building, then we have other processes to individually assess those, because you can get commercial developments that say use a lot of water, for example, and have a much bigger demand on our infrastructure services, like say a car wash, versus a storage unit which would use very little water in comparison to an office block. So we do have different methodologies for assessing different commercial developments. That's just our standard, and then there's an obvious tailoring to assess other types of commercial developments. And then we just convert that back to an equivalent household unit based on demand for those services.
Yeah. So, and that sits in the policy under special assessments. It's got a nice criteria. So the maps can be, sorry, this isn't a very kind picture to put up, but there's water catchments, and that's based around the reservoirs and pumping stations around the city. Wastewater, there's only 3 citywide. So, there's related to Moa Point and then the northern areas. Transport, there's a few different special projects that relate to zones, and then there's citywide. Reserves, stormwater is only citywide, and then community infrastructure, and that'll be for things like the public library sitting there, and that's attributed citywide, so you can't say who's going to use it relatively more or less. That goes across the city. This is an example of a close-up catchment map. So there, if anyone's putting an infill house there, or if there's a small new development area, that gets added at that map. So again, this isn't a tremendously kind slide, but this is to show you the mechanics of this table is the heart and soul of the policy. If you're looking for the charges, what they are and what they relate to. So this table is from the current policy, and I don't know if it's worth zooming in. Oh, 1 second now. I won't try zooming in. I can't. Okay. Yeah. So here we have the table. It speaks to policy map zones across the top. Then there's a residential fee for the citywide contributions, and one for non-residential. And the reason for this difference is that we don't charge the citywide community infrastructure or citywide reserve charges on non-residential. So it's got the same numbers sitting behind it, but just some of the charges are dropped for non-residential. Then you've got water supply by catchment, wastewater by catchment, transport by catchment, and reserves. So you can see that transport and reserves show up in relatively few areas, and those would relate to the more greenfields areas where new reserve land has been purchased or new roads are being built. So once you start to see higher development contributions, it means it's likely to mean it's a newer area with new roads, new water supply being put in for that specific area. Yeah, and you'll see like the wastewater catchment charge is the same for several areas. That relates to Moa Point and the other 2 wastewater areas. Okay.
The key of that table really shows you how nuanced the policy is, because effectively every capital project that has a growth component has to flow through into a specific geographic location, and therefore you're just charging the capacity of the infrastructure into the location that is being developed. So where there's capacity being planned to be built, there's going to be higher charges. We can't charge for capacity that's already been built into the network prior to the DC policy, where there's surplus capacity. We can't recover that from our development contributions, and so that may add to some areas having lower charges. And as Lila points out, greenfield sites are far more expensive because there's a whole lot of brand new infrastructure as opposed to brownfield sites, which most of those catchments are in, where you can upgrade infrastructure as you're renewing it, and which is doesn't cost so much, and therefore that keeps those development contribution charges down.
Okay. So we'll go over that again in a second. We'll talk to some averages around the country, but this is the current citywide charge. You can see it's like 165 across the city for stormwater. That charge is likely to be going up, and similar the wastewater and water supply. So yeah, when you get the new policy next week, this is a component that you'll see a rise in. So at the moment, so this is just a summary of our current fee range. At the moment, it's 3,000 to 10,000, commercial 2.5 to 10. And they're modest to other authorities, and they're modest, and that's related to the low number of greenfields. So Martin's already mentioned how the greenfields bring things up. Did you want to say anything? Talk again to that, or talk to the other?
No, I think it's probably reasonably widely known that Wellington's development contribution charges are quite low compared to other authorities. And that probably speaks to the fact that we don't have a lot of greenfields development or a lot of area to develop for greenfields compared to other authorities. Not many TLAs have development contributions policies. I think there's only about 10 across the country at this point. So it's mainly growth councils that are responding to growth and demand from population increases. So the likes of Auckland, Tauranga, Hamilton, all have DC policies, and now some more are being developed in the Wellington region as well, in the Hutt and Porirua. Our charges are lower probably because our brownfield sites have lower charges, and other authorities have more greenfield sites. Would probably be the general comment. Hamilton and we're also obviously updating ours, so ours are going to increase. But just to give you an example, Hamilton's range goes from 9 to 102,000, Porirua 16 to 42,000, Auckland 11 to 84,000. So there's some pretty significant contributions out there required when you're getting up around the $100,000. Before, that's not including the land value and the actual development itself, before a developer's developing a site. It's pretty expensive for putting in greenfield infrastructure.
Okay, cool, thanks. So I'm feeling, this is probably a bit less interactive as we're on Zoom. So just to reassure you, we've just got a couple more slides to go through, and then we'll be able to open up for discussion points. So some of the details about how things work, they're charged at usually at building consent or service connection. Greenfields development tend to have agreements, so we've talked about those earlier, the special through the special assessments. We talked about the special assessments for commercial buildings, but quite often in a greenfield development there'll be an agreement. So someone's putting in 400 houses. They might choose to put in the roads themselves and vest those roads to the council, so they'll take on that expense, and the development contribution won't pick that up. Also, you get credits if you're replacing a building. So if you're pulling down an old house and replacing it with 2, you'll just pay for 1 because you get a credit for the existing one. And same if you're converting use, that's all worked through if you're converting an office building to residences and back, or the other way around. And so the main changes that you'll be seeing, so the policy is up on our website. It's really quite accessible on the website because it's split into the parts in the policy section. And when the changes that we're going to see next, so next week when you get the full set, you'll get a statement of proposal and the full policy. It is about 50 to 60 pages long, just giving a a heads up, and that's because there's a lot of content to work through all the parts of the Local Government Act. It needs to. The template follows the principles and specifications more clearly. Some parts have got quite legalistic language and cross-references. And what we found relative to our current policy, some sections are expanded and some condensed, but it's all pretty much there. There'll be increases in the charges from the increased capital expenditure for growth, 2021 to 31, and that's relative to the previous two. And we're updating a few of the maps, just changes at the margins, but also the maps look like they were produced in 2009 when they were last reviewed, and we'll get a modern look and feel to the maps. And then there's an ongoing review. So things like Let's Get Willie Moving is not yet in the DCP, so it's only for expenditure that's part of a budgeted project. There's potential for Three Waters change in the next few years. There's ongoing improvement. So we've reframed how some of the processes run. It's just checking and testing those, looking at the cost benefit of the policy, and we've set up, so everyone who's been working on it will stay in touch. And there's something in the policy called the Green Building Remission. That's a discount on buildings that meet a Green Star rating, and that's carrying through unchanged. It does have its home in the Development Contributions Policy. It's possible that something like that could have a home in a different policy, but for now it's staying. It doesn't have another home, and it seems to be working fine where it is. So from today, so as we hear questions today, we're still really checking the policy and finalising papers and drafting them in some cases. So what we hope to do with questions from today is work them into the next presentation on the 19th of October, into the council papers, in the statement of proposal and Q&A for Let's Talk. And we can also speak to any questions in the remaining half hour of this session. Have I missed anything, Martin?
No, that's good. Thanks, Lila. Councillor Calvert, I wonder if we've just had a few technical issues in the meeting room and can't actually see the list of attendees. I was just wondering whether maybe Councillor Calvert could manage the questions with the hands up.
Stop sharing your screen.
I'm sorry, no, I can't. I'm working on my phone, so it's not possible.
Okay.
I wasn't aware that I should be chairing this meeting, as you're probably aware.
I'm wondering if,
I
I can chair.
what
Councillor
about Laura or Laurie as deputy chair? Or I'm happy to do it, actually. I'll step in and manage the questions. Okay, so that's all right. No, I don't know if I'll get exactly the right order, but I have seen that Jenny and Jill have been there for a while, so I'll start with Jenny.
Thanks, Sarah. This isn't, I apologise, it's not really a question, it's a comment, and it's probably a little bit of oversensitivity from being on the mayoral task force for Three Waters. But Marty, the slide that you had that sort of set out that, you know, renewals are funded by depreciation and growth is funded by the development contributions was probably, the slide was a bit oversimplified. I think what you said was perfectly accurate, which is that we use depreciation to pay down debt and then we borrow on top of that. But I think it would be really useful in the slides or in any communications, we've got to be really careful that we set that out really, really specifically and accurately, because that's how we got into some misunderstanding and trouble in the past. So I just was just a comment that I really will be looking closely to make sure that when the papers come out that all of that is set out really clearly and specifically and accurately. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I guess just to respond to that, so it does get confusing once you don't simplify it. And so whilst you finance each of those three buckets from borrowings, you then fund it through depreciation, borrowings and development contributions to repay those borrowings. Whilst they're not ring-fenced, they are measured and repay, the borrowings repaid from those different sources.
Yeah, which is great. So yeah, I just think you need to set that out, and I would rather it be slightly more complicated and give everyone a very accurate view of what is actually happening rather than oversimplified, which is, I think, an issue we've had in the past.
Thank you, Councillor Conti. Can people take their hands down when they're finished as well? I'm as guilty as anyone of that. So the next up is Councillor Day.
Kia ora, thank you for that. It's quite complex and still trying to get my head around all of that detail, but thank you. So one of the comments that's been made in our local community, so we've got Chuden Park, which has experienced huge growth over quite a long period of time, and probably some of the facilities that have been built maybe didn't necessarily anticipate the future growth. So they've got a community centre that's too small, and so I'm wondering a couple of things. Are our greenfield contributions really low as well? Because you were saying that brownfields are low, but it's greenfields that have been low as well.
The answer to that's no, in the sense that the policy is trying to recover all growth-related costs. So the only component where there's a bit of a grey area is where there is a remission for green buildings, and so they don't. We don't have the I guess the pure science around the remission having a lower impost on the infrastructure. But other than that, all contributions are refunding growth-related capacity in the network. What you may be referring to is, have we put enough growth-related capacity into the network? And that, I guess, is a debatable point in some respects, which is really probably going to be answered by the planning for growth project, and that'll be coming through, the spatial plan and the district plan changes, and that will be refined. So we're attempting to do it, but the finer points on those will come through in due course with the planning for growth project, and so that will be flushed out at the next LTP, and we're also looking at refining all of those technical details over the next review of this policy, which will sort of kick off once this first review is done. So this first review, as Leela has pointed out, is really updating the current CapEx and the LTP with a few policy changes. The next one will be looking in more detail at all of the planning side of it.
In those tables you showed, there were 4 categories that the development contributions were collected for, and it didn't actually mention social infrastructure in those. It had like I can't remember what the categories were, but I noticed there wasn't social infrastructure. I don't know if you can share it again, but we do collect DCs for social infrastructure, do we?
So yeah, they'll be under the community infrastructure, which we are now allowed to collect upon. Previously, it was in the policy originally, then it came out with Government Act, and now it's gone back in. So we will be collecting on them this time. So it'll be a new charge which weren't on those slides because we didn't have it in the last policy.
Oh, okay, that's quite interesting.
And just to add to that, Councillor Day, the legislation changed to remove community infrastructure, so we weren't allowed. So originally it was in, then it had to be taken out, and now it's been put back in.
When did it get taken out? What year was?
Probably around 2012. Yeah.
It shouldn't really have affected underinvestment in Chuden Park, but it's very clear that there's been quite significant underinvestment. So they're in a situation of having not enough community space for a rapidly growing community. And I guess we're just going to have to figure out how we can improve that going forward. Do the new maps include our anticipated growth areas, so like Upper Stebbings and Lincolnshire Farm, and will they be included?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, we will need to keep moving because I've actually got quite a lot of hands. I've got Councillor Rush, Councillor O'Neill, Councillor Pannett, Councillor Matthews, and Councillor Flynn still to go. So can we please get questions and answers?
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks. So guys, I spent a bit of time with on Octum talking about water sensitive urban design and how we want to build that into the district plan. And Wellington property owners we spoke to said we're well behind the play here and are doing it all everywhere else. So I'm just wondering, is the DC's policy, I see you talk about green building remissions, but is there other incentives that will see us do a step change in water sensitive urban design?
in
Or
essence,
do we need to leave that to the planning documents?
that needs to be in the planning, and it's sort of a slightly different area, because what we're doing here actually is recovering costs for infrastructure. So the costs are there irrespective. Any remission we give transfers the cost away from the developments and the people funding those developments and onto ratepayers who haven't caused those costs. And so this is fundamentally a funding policy, and therefore it has to go through the Local Government Act funding process, and we have to consider who benefits and who causes the costs, and that's why we're recovering costs from developers. So anything in terms of level of service increase, we can't charge for, and anything in terms of growth, we should be attributing to the people causing the need for that growth and not existing ratepayers.
So, and I don't want to hold things up, but the thinking behind it was that if a smart developer can take the pressure off our network by good planning and water-sensitive urban design, then that should result in a reduction in what we would charge them. So, but what I'm hearing is that we haven't gone to that point.
If a developer does a development that causes a reduction in use compared to the standard reduction that we've got in our policy, then that's a legitimate cause for a remission, and we can. If they're providing effectively services for the community that we hadn't planned and aren't recovering costs for in the policy, then that isn't. And so an example of that would be if a developer says, I'm going to give the city or make some public land green space available, but we hadn't planned it and it's not part of our plans, we don't give them a remission for that because we weren't recovering the costs for that. So it's not even part of the component of the cost structure, and therefore the DCs don't cover it. So there's nothing to remit on that basis. I mean, that's a pretty simplistic example, but
yeah. So a big
what's happening here? Okay, all right. Well, I think we need to move on. Or is there some discussion happening in the background with staff?
Carry on. No, we can carry on.
Okay, we'll carry on. Councillor, I think we're up to Councillor O'Neill.
Thank you. I have two parts. My first one was, how do we measure for expected overcrowding and housing quantities in Wellington, given at the moment we don't have enough supply and we're likely to see more and more overcrowding, particularly in the next couple of years and things like that? Is that realised in the DC policy, or how do we?
So I can try and speak to that. It's a little out of scope. Kia ora. I'm not sure if I'm looking. Oh yes, there I am looking at the camera. Yeah. So overcrowding is definitely a concern. It's a concern for any city and for government policy. In terms of the development contributions policy, it's really a charge on buildings, and it's based off average occupancy per building. So it doesn't look at the actuals of who's going to live in the buildings and that. So it's not something that's addressed in the policy, and there's assumptions about properties not being overcrowded.
Yeah. Essentially, it's not taken into account. It's we do use an average of occupants per house. I think it's 2.6, which is just a flat average. The issue is, I think I've heard this policy or the legislation described as a perfect piece of theoretical sort of legislation that's impossible to implement accurately. But what that means is, if you started going down to number of occupants per household, then people would start being able to apply for remissions based on the number of current occupants in the household. But this policy looks at long-term averages and then averages across the city. Otherwise, it becomes so nuanced that it'll be impossible to implement. And so we don't want to be giving remissions based on how many people are currently in a household, because that will then change over time. And therefore you would be constantly going through a process of remissions and then also additional charges based on increases and reductions in household numbers.
And perversely, if a household was overhead, the more people that were in a household would actually charge them more, which would not actually be in the outcome we're seeking.
It's about the builder. Can I talk to you?
Yeah.
Everybody there?
Cool. I've got one other question, and that is to do with the use of space. So with our new district plan, because we're not requiring households to have car parks on their properties anymore, and so more cars will probably end up on our footpaths or on our roads and things like that. So I just was curious to understand if in the DC policy, how we realise people's vehicles and other assets and extensions of their house, and how that kind of fits into development contributions, whether it's like caravans or extra space being taken up on the road, and if any of, kind of sideline to that, if any of the DCs that people pay go towards making footpaths in the area more accessible, if we're putting more people into a particular place, making footpaths wider and those sorts of things.
Yeah, so it's probably a little misnomer because we just call it transport, but it is actually funding all of the forms of transportation. So it's the footpaths, it's the cycleways, and the roads. So it's not based on cars per household, for example. So it's just based on the occupants, and it's the people that are I guess moving, irrespective of the mode of transport, and therefore the charges are based on that.
All right, thanks for that. I think we're up to Councillor Pannett.
Thanks for that. I've got two questions. One is, can you just remind me, is it a strict legislative requirement that our DC policy must, there's not a philosophical understanding that there is a shared benefit from more good quality housing and more green housing? Because that was the thing with the remissions for green buildings, which Celia and I put on, that it was supposed to benefit everyone, not just be distributed to other ratepayers to cover. So I know it's a bit complicated.
Yes, so you know, it is at council's discretion to not have a development contributions policy at all, right through to fully funding the growth component by development contributions. So you can, you know, it's at council's discretion to not fully fund growth with development contributions. The previous policies have attempted to do that, and that is and we did move away from that slightly with the green buildings remission. I think there was a number of reasons behind that. And so we don't have to, but that's been the case in the past. What I'm saying, when you go back to the funding mechanisms in the legislation, you just have to make the considerations around who benefits and who should pay, just like all of our other activities in the revenue and financing policy. So we can't charge development contributions. It's more the other way. We can't charge development contributions if people aren't benefiting from it, but we don't have to charge them. But we do have to consider who benefits and who should pay.
Okay, and then just the other question is, obviously we've got some, besides my dogs, policy imperatives around more affordable housing, more green housing. With these DCs, are we likely to see, you know, increasing requirements for environmentally sustainable but affordable housing go up?
I don't think so. This is not a regulatory mechanism. It's literally a funding mechanism for the infrastructure for those houses. So we haven't differentiated between, say, on a neighbours rating or any other types of green housing rating. We haven't differentiated the impost on the infrastructure. That would be very nuanced and quite complex to build into the policy. I'm not saying it can't happen in the future, but it hasn't happened to this point.
So it happens in the big building, you know, big office apartments. It could happen as part of a development agreement, but on a case-by-case basis, when you look at some of these are infill houses, and the marginal difference is quite hard to cater for in a policy that is a funding policy. For example, if someone has a water tank on their house or not, it's probably best those incentives live elsewhere, like the cost benefit of installing the water tank.
Yeah, the remission for the large, it's only for commercial buildings, not for residential buildings, so it's not apartment buildings. There's a whole lot of detail to work through, but for example, if you're collecting rainwater to reduce your impost on the water network, if it doesn't rain, then we still have to provide the facility to provide potable water through the network. So you might be actually reducing the impost, but our capacity to deliver it to you doesn't necessarily change. So there's a lot of that sort of thing that needs to be worked through, and that's what I'm talking about, the details and the nuances that need to be worked through if we were going to implement something like that.
Yeah, and I find it's a topic I have an interest in, having worked on water conservation before. I mean, I can see there's definitely a place for that, but it's also looking at the proportion of properties that are come under the development contributions relative to all properties that could be changed, and likely to be other mechanisms.
There's just as an aside, we are going to start some other work, which would probably would sit more closely around how have better building incentives. Is there anything that we can do which is a bit more wider, which how that works? This may not be the best place for that to sit. Maybe we need to look at other work around that space.
Okay. If I could just chip in too, we've just recently had an applicant come to us to ask us if we give any special remissions for co-housing and some of these more modern housing types. Is there any response? Or again, does that just come into we haven't yet considered it? It's quite complex to do.
Yeah, at the moment it's still functional, and it's based on the demand for the need for infrastructure. And so the social outcomes haven't been built into this. It's quite functional at the moment.
Okay, lovely. We do need to keep moving. So Councillor Matthews, and then we have Councillor Foon, and that's actually all at the minute.
Okay, so mine is somewhat related to the questions that Iona was asking about the interaction between growth and the DCs, because I guess I have a concern that we might say, well, this work is coming, but we're in the midst of a housing crisis, and to kind of say that we're going to look at the broader infrastructure issues for growth later is something that I don't think is quite going to sit well with the public. And also I'm concerned that, it'll be seen as an anti-growth measure by raising development contributions. So I'm just it's not even really a question, but it's kind of a comment about how these things interact. And I can see that Liam's on the line. I don't want to put him on the spot, but I actually think we can't see these things or present them in isolation from each other.
Yeah, just because it's not in there now, it doesn't mean to say it hasn't been considered in the past and the present, I guess. And when you peel back the complexity, it is quite functional around the cause of the infrastructure and the cost of that, and then the benefit of that infrastructure and relating that cost to the beneficiaries. So we have looked at that other level of granularity in the past, and some of it is built in wherever we can. We've flexed the policy to do that, but I guess it's around the core, the purpose of the policy and what other mechanisms council can influence via its other mandates through regulation, through funding, through influencing, etc. as well. And so that's where this is one component of a bigger picture to try and provide some solutions to those issues.
Hey,
I think it would.
Rebecca,
yeah,
sorry, I am here.
Yeah.
I'm just saying my desk, so unfortunately I can't get my camera on team, but look, you've read it absolutely correctly. I mean, we have to try to keep this narrative at a high level. And I always explain to staff, because of course a number of us realise the endeavour this city's showing in terms of accommodating growth. And at this particular point in time, this is an update to the DC policy, not a review of it. And there is some frustration internally that we just haven't had the bandwidth to get on top of a more comprehensive review of the DC policy. But as Marty's already indicated, that is in the pipeline. It is on its way. So it's not lost to us, Rebecca, that narrative's got to be there. The issue we have is quite a complex one. Certainly understanding the issue Karori has, as an example. We really need to understand there's a huge suburb there that has potential to grow, but we have infrastructure constraints there, and we need to work very carefully with Wellington Water on what that solution to allow more growth in Karori to occur is. And one of the things perhaps in terms of communicating to your residents that the councillors could be reminded of is that we always talk about this last long-term plan as a catch-up for infrastructure deficit, if you like, and the next LTP will be about growth, and that's where I hope a wonderful symphony of DC policy will happen, and it'll be playing the same tune. So I hope that's helpful, but no, absolutely valid point, Rebecca, and we're very conscious of that.
Thank you, and I think it's important that should be in the narrative of whatever papers we get as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Councillor Foon.
Kia ora. I think Deputy Mayor Free asked my question on the collective housing opportunity, but the other question I have is around how do the DCs, understanding that Wellingtons are generally seen as quite low and developers are not necessarily just based in Wellington, what is the narrative from them around how they perceive the DCs compared to wherever else they're trying to develop? Like what's the common thinking about Wellington's DCs as they stand?
Yeah, I haven't received a lot of feedback recently, but I have, been involved in DCs for a number of years. And whenever developers have come in, initially there were probably complaints about it when it first came in, but it was more around the communication that they existed, what the charges were, the size of them, etc. Once we got over that hurdle, and councillors have questioned, a lot of property developers in Wellington when they have come to make submissions to council and asked them whether, they've been prohibitive to developments and things. And I don't recall any of them saying yes in a straightforward way. So they have been considered reasonably low. They've been acknowledged that they're lower than other areas in the country. And I think we did do some work, it was a number of years ago now, to say that they weren't more than sort of 2 to 3% of the cost of a development. And so they weren't really within, the margin of error of saying I will or will not go ahead with the development because of the development contributions. So that's sort of a historical thing. Our development contributions levels haven't increased much since that feedback's come back, so I would expect that to be in a pretty similar space.
I'd concur with that, Laurie. Actually, I haven't heard anything in my time here. What's interesting is the concern around some of the water infrastructure requirements through conditions on consent, and even Wellington Electricity is featuring quite a bit now as well. I was in conversation only just yesterday with a developer talking about the surprise they were getting from those two entities when their consent was issued and the conditions placed on them. These surprises are additional costs onto the development they didn't otherwise expect. What's really important though, Laurie, is developer certainty. They don't mind, as long as they know what they have to pay, they don't mind. What they don't like is the surprises. But yeah, I can't recall the DC levels being raised as an issue in my time here.
All right, fascinating though this discussion is. I think we've run out of time. But thank you, everybody. Thank you to the staff. Thanks, colleagues. Really good questions. It looks like we have come to the end of them. Thank you, Liam and your team, and Layla, and yeah, everybody really. So, right, we'll see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.